Hello and welcome to Android Design in Action. My name is Roman Nurik. With me here today is...
Hi guys, Adam Koch, and over in London.
Hi, Nick Butcher.
So today, unlike most days on the show, most Tuesdays on the show, we're not actually going to be talking about redesigns. So for those of you, who have never seen this show, we usually take a look at apps that have been nominated. Usually the developer nominates themselves. And take a look at how we can reimagine some of the screens in those apps to fit better with, Android styling and just be, kind of a better experience for users overall. And then we take that and we pass it off to developers and, see if they like it. And if they do, then sometimes they make the changes and sometimes they don't. And for those of you, who have been watching, basically developers can come back on Thursday and let us know what they think of the show, and that's the Developer Strikes Back, or Developers Strike Back show. This week, however, we're not doing any of that. Because of the massive technical failures that plagued the guys in Mountain View for the Friday App Clinic, we've decided to take a slightly different approach to the shows, or to this episode today. So today we're going to be talking about responsive design. So let's jump into what responsive design is. Now, for several people, this is the first time they're hearing of the concept of responsive design. And Ethan Marcotte, and sorry Ethan if I'm mispronouncing your name, Ethan Marcotte coined the term a few years ago in an article that talked about responsive web design. And basically you can see from the quote here, this is from the article, it's really about taking a website and making sure that it scales across any medium, be it phone, tablet, browser at different screen sizes, and pretty much any other device type. So taking a single layout or a single piece of content and making sure that it scales according to its medium. So that's responsive web design in a super small nutshell. Responsive web design applies to mobile apps as well. And so today we're going to be talking about responsive design and how it applies to Android devices. Before we jump in, Adam, Nick, any comments? Any thoughts?
Well, as you were saying, we're focusing on responsive design because this week we're having a big focus on tablets. We've just launched some quality guidelines on how to make a high quality tablet application. And for me, having an application which scales well on the huge variety of devices that is the Android landscape is, a big part of that quality. So I think this is a really important topic.
Yeah, and one quick thing I wanted to mention was I really believe if you sort of think about these responsive web design or responsive Android development from the beginning of your development cycle when building Android apps, it can help you get that tablet app or like create designs that just really make it easier to suit all the different screens out there. So rather than just sort of designing for phone from the ground up, if you just think about all these things from the beginning, it really helps.
And before we jump in again, just to talk a little bit about the format, we're not really going to be talking about development best practices. We do have several training sessions on developer.android.com on how to actually implement these concepts. But what we will do is we will look into existing apps that are out there and see how they treat or how they implement these responsive designs, how they kind of scale fluidly across the different device types. So let's jump in. First, we're going to take a look at Calendar. So this is the built-in calendar application that comes with many devices like the Galaxy Nexus, the Nexus 7, the Motorola Zoom. And this is an example of the screen that lets you create a new calendar entry. So on the phone here, you see that, and I'm going to go zoom in for a second. On the phone, you see that you have kind of a done cancel bar at the top, which is basically replacing the action bar. And the different entry fields like the calendar event title, the date, time, things like that. Pretty typical stuff. And then on the Nexus 7, you'll see that it's switched over into a kind of like a multi-column layout where on the left column you have the labels of the different text entry fields, and on the right you have the fields themselves. And then on the tablet, on the 10-inch tablet in landscape, I'm going to zoom in here, sorry about that. You'll notice that it's basically the same screen as the screen in portrait, except it has wider margins. So basically they've decided that let's make sure that the content, the text fields never go past a pretty common number, around 45 to 75 characters. Let's make sure that you can never see more than that all at once, so that the line lengths aren't too long. So to fit that constraint, let's introduce margins along the sides. So that's in a gist, in a nutshell, what the calendar apps create event screen looks like. Guys, any thoughts on other things that they've done really well here to make sure that this is responsive?
I'd probably just like to call out as well, we talk a lot on this show about Holo, about the visual language of Android, the Holo visual theme, and that it has its own certain flat look and feel. And I just want to call out why that's, it's not an accident that kind of design scheme was chosen for Android. And I think this set of screens here really demonstrates how Holo helps you to create a user interface which scales nicely by using kind of typography and spacing appropriately to give your application structure, which you can clearly see in these three screens. There isn't a lot of Chrome subdividing boxes and so on. It's text boxes and so on. It really is the content which defines the structure of the page, and that really helps it to scale. You haven't got lots and lots and lots of different bitmap assets or graphical assets or gradients all over the place, which may look strange when scaled up and wouldn't really help you out in this field. So I think this is one of my major takeaways from looking at the calendar application, is that how Holo really helps out this app to scale across these screen sizes.
Yeah, and one quick point from me, if you look at the white space on the margins, let's see, if we zoom in here, so you can see on the phone you've got some white space on the left and right, and then if you go up to the Nexus 7, you'll see there's slightly more white space. And then if you go across to the landscape zoom, you'll see they've actually got more white space here that sort of makes everything fill out the larger screen size there.
And it's important to know that when you're creating or defining these margins, that you still stick to a grid. And as you can see in our design guide, under the metrics and grid section, we have this concept of a 16-dip grid and a 48 dp rhythm. So using increments of 16 dips, so like 32 dip or 48 or 64, that can kind of still introduce structure into your layouts without kind of constraining you to just using very small margins. So 32 dips, 48 dips, that's great kind of to use for larger devices such as tablets.
Yeah, so a naive implementation of this calendar screen might have just stretched the input fields all the way across, which would look pretty ungainly on the 10-inch. So I think it's approaching your screen design when you're designing an app, and if you see something which is like Phil Pattrn, thinking about how is that going to look on a much wider display like a 10-inch in landscape, for example, and bearing in mind where you might want to start introducing these margin points.
All right, so let's move on to the next app. So this will be the first third-party app that we look at, and this is Pattrn. Nick, do you want to talk a little bit about Pattrn?
Sure. So Pattrn is a great little app for finding wallpapers for your device. It's by a UK developer called Lucas, who works for Mozilla. And I think they've done a great job of really making the content adapt. Luckily for them, they have almost the dream application for this kind of scenario, where the content, the patterned wallpapers, have no kind of concept of aspect ratio or anything like that. They actually kind of tile, so that it works really well that they can change for different aspect ratios, which might not be the case for some apps. But as you can see in the free screens we're showing here, on the phone they're relying on free tabs to go through the three major views of the data. But when they get beyond a certain point and have more space, they actually break that out away from the tab navigation into having this sidebar, which I think works really well. Rather than just stretching the content to be overly wide, it actually gives you easier navigation, as well as surfacing more information. So you can see there on the Nexus 7, for example, it surfaces recent searches. So it's kind of one tap away, rather than having to tap into the search field and then get shown the recent history. It might prompt you to click on a recent search, which is really great. The other thing, if you look at the difference between, say, the phone and the 7-inch tablet, is they've actually hinted the text size and paddings to be slightly larger, to just feel more comfortable at that certain size.
And it looks like,
and
sorry, Nick, it looks like on a tablet they have just a slightly wider margin. I don't know if it's an increment of 16 dips like we talked about, but it's definitely noticeably larger to the left and to the right of the patterns.
yeah, and then just lastly, you can say when you step up from the 7 to the 10-inch and have even more space available, they break out into this kind of grid view where they're showing more potential wallpapers on screen at once. So it's kind of reimagining the content, like show it the representation of the content. So it's the same content but laid out in a completely different way to just make much better use of the space.
Yeah, and I think I just wanted to comment on one missed opportunity, and this is very minor, but if you look at the handset version in landscape, we don't have a screenshot here, but they also Lucas also uses a single column for the patterns. So since he's already got multi-column implemented, it seems like it would be fairly trivial to switch that over to a multi-column, like a 2-column layout in landscape. That might work really well. Okay, so let's move on to the next app, unless you guys have any more comments.
Just one question. I haven't actually used this app that much, but what's under the U tab in for the handset version? I don't know, Roman or Nick.
Mm-hmm. Nick, I actually don't remember myself. I think it was both favorites. I think it was favorites and something else, but it was a combination of either one.
So I guess it's just interesting to note how they've definitely changed the structure just a little bit on the handset version. Just so they can fit it into the three standard tabs there and make it still look nice.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. So let me just do a time check. Okay, so the next app is Pocket, and Pocket is actually, I think it's called Pocket, formerly Read It Later. Pocket is basically it's a saved list of articles. So if you're browsing an RSS feed and you don't want to read it right now, you just go off and save it to Pocket, and they have an intent that you can share to and all those good things. So this is the kind of the main screen in Pocket that lets you see the list of your saved articles. So you'll see that on the phone they have a simple list with thumbnails on the right. Now, when you scale it up to a 7-inch tablet, they have a 2-column grid, and if you turn that over into landscape, you'll see that there's a 3-column grid. And you'll notice that it's completely different, but it's the same content, right? It's more like a tile view rather than a simple, horizontal linear layout. And then if you look at the 10-inch tablet, they've basically graduated into more of a quote-unquote magazine layout, similar to how the Google Play client application lays out the different tiles in the featured sections. So the interesting thing to me is that they've done a lot of work here to tweak font sizes. So you'll notice that like the title sizes on the 10-inch tablet are slightly larger than on the 7-inch tablet. And then the fact that they've basically implemented this layout 3 times. Once as a list, another as a grid view, which is probably a simplified version of the magazine layout on the right, but they also have that kind of the magazine layout, which we don't have framework support for. One of the things I should know is they may have cheated a little bit. They may be using WebView and HTML5 and CSS3 stuff to do the layout, which is it's perfectly awesome. The only issue is that there's some minor performance penalties. Well, maybe not minor, but there are some performance penalties involved. But overall, it looks just wonderful. Yeah, so that's in a nutshell. The other thing I wanted to mention is that they kept the action bar the same, and this is totally fine. It's you don't necessarily have to switch the action bar, make it taller, make things wider. The framework actually does all of those things for you. It'll make your icon slightly wider, the action bar slightly taller, so it'll do all those things for you. In this case, I think that they've probably implemented a custom action bar, so it's not happening there. But note that the action bar is pretty much the same across tablet and phone in terms of behavior and rough proportions.
So one of my favorite things they've done on here as well, is that you can see on the phone and tablet they've prioritized the search, bringing it out right at the top of the content view, so you can search and filter. Whereas on the tablet they've kind of demoted that to less important. I think it's under the action overflow there, which I think is really interesting. I think it's shown that they've thought about how someone's going to use this application slightly differently on a tablet. That they have the same content available, but it's a different representation. They're kind of designing for a different use case where someone might have more time and might be in more of an explorative mood.
Yep. Any comments? Any other comments? Okay, so let's move on to, I believe oh no, there's TED. Let's talk about TED, Adam.
Yeah, so the TED app, hopefully some of you are familiar with the TED app and all the great content, video talks that they have. So I like this example just because it's fairly simple. Like, you don't have to do anything crazy complicated in order to support different form factors and have it look nice and feel nice still. So if you look at the 3 different form factors that we posted up here, you've got the handset in portrait mode, where they have the sort of big thumbnail at the top and then 3 sub-tabs down the bottom to show the sort of different views related to that video. And then you move to Nexus 7, which looks fairly similar. They've added some extra white space. Let's just zoom in here a little bit. They've added some extra white space, notably around the tabs as well, which is interesting. But otherwise, it's fairly similar. Extra white space, slightly bumped up font size. And then if you move to the landscape 10-inch, let me zoom across here. You'll notice that they've moved from the sort of stacked layout of their fragments to being side by side. But essentially, it's the same fragments. You can clearly tell they've reused the same fragments there. One interesting thing for the sort of video thumbnail here is they've moved the title from being a sort of transparent overlay to beneath the actual video because there's more room, and they can really bring out the sort of nice video thumbnails, allocating a little bit more space for that. Guys, do you have any comments?
I just wanted to mention one thing about the overall, I guess the overall structure of the screen. It reminds me of the YouTube playback screen on Android, and I think that that's actually a good thing. I think that users, when they buy their Android device, they pop open YouTube, they instantly become familiar with how it behaves, and I'm guessing if you rotate into landscape, it starts at full screens. They're very familiar with how it behaves, the kind of the tab structure at the bottom on the phone that lets you switch between the different pieces of detail information about the video. And then in tablet, they basically do something, again, very similar to YouTube. They pop that over to the right. And this is almost like a natural way to take up the new amount of, or to do something with the new space that you have. But I think that just like that added extra bit of similarity to the YouTube app makes it instantly familiar to users. Nick, anything else before we move on?
I just think they've done a great job of playing with the spacing as well. I think you can see that they've definitely hinted the spacing when you go from phone up to 7-inch to make it just feel that much more comfortable on that size device. So it's the kind of thing where you might have just tried the phone layout on the 7-inch device and thought, hey, that's good enough. But they've actually gone the extra mile to say, actually, it feels a little bit cramped or would benefit from a little bit more spacing here. So they've gone the extra mile to really optimize for the different device sizes, which is great.
Yeah, it's worth noting as well that they don't have a landscape layout for this particular screen on handset devices. Actually, I'm not sure if they actually have landscape for any of their screens on handset. But for a video app, especially for a video detail screen like this, I think that's okay sometimes. Because people sort of expect that when they rotate, the video will be playing full screen instead. There's not really enough room to do much else there. So yeah, that's TED.
Okay, so let's move on to, I believe, the last app. So we're kind of cheating here because this is an app that we all worked on. This is the Google I/O 2012 application. So basically, this app, if you attended the conference, it lets you, see what sessions are playing. It lets you create a schedule, a personalized schedule, and it also syncs across your different devices, which again is very important for a multi-device, user that has multiple devices, having seamless sync across those. So what we've done here is basically, on phone there isn't that much horizontal space, so we have 3 tabs for the different core pieces of functionality. That's kind of the interaction side where you interact with other people on Google+. That are also attending the conference, the My Schedule or My Agenda area, and then the exploration phase where you can look at the map or take a look at individual tracks. So the interesting thing that we've done here is we've split it up from tabs to multiple panes across tablets. So in Portrait, actually both of these devices, 7-inch and the 10-inch device, in Portrait they would show this kind of 3-column or 2-column layout where 2 of the panes are stacked in 1 column. And then in Landscape they switch to a wider 3-column layout. One of the key differences between the 7-inch and 10-inch layouts here is that the margins here on a 7-inch are 16 dip, and here on a tablet that's 10 inches, they're 32 dip. And that actually gives a little bit more breathing room for the content on this 10-inch device. And you'll notice this on the next screen as well once we get to it, that this kind of adds a sense of spacing and the separation of the two pieces of content, or in here the three different pieces of content. Any thoughts, guys?
It's a beautiful app.
Whoever designed this is amazing.
One thing I forgot to mention is that you can't see this in the screenshot, but these tabs on phone, as you swipe across them, there's actually a 16-dip divider that it's actually just empty space. That divider is the same gray background as is on the tablets, so like in this area. So if you have multiple devices, there's a subtle hint that these are actually part of the same screen. So as you slide on a phone, like I said, you see that gray background, giving you that sense of separation.
Yeah, one last thing. One thing I really like personally is on the tablet layouts, the sort of alignment of the headings of each of the different fragments. It just makes the app feel really nice. And as Roman was saying, it's got the sort of padding, the equal padding there between the different sections here. And also the little ticker, which I can't remember what it's called. The
what's on fragment.
Yeah, the what's on fragment. It just sort of, the alignment there looks really nice. Makes everything look really consistent.
One thing that we haven't done here is use Roboto Thin or Roboto Light, which we probably should have. So in case you want to make the titles stand out even more, get even more attention, I'm not convinced that it's necessary here, but you could use a large point size and Roboto Thin to kind of give an elegant header to each of these panes. Okay, so let's move on to the second screen in this app, and this is basically the session detail screen. So once I get into a specific session, like in this case, the session that Chris and Ellie gave on Android apps and Google Play, where they announced the new Publisher Console. Once I get into the screen, there's a bunch of information that I might want to see, a bunch of actions I may want to take on the session. For example, I may want to add it or remove it from my schedule, share it with people, see a map of it, things like that. I may want to +1 it up here, and I may want to see the list of speakers, learn more about Chris or Ellie, and then there's a few links at the bottom. So what we've done here is, this is a single screen on, the session detail and the list of sessions, which is a previous screen. This is a single screen on phones, whereas on tablets it's combined into a multi-pane layout. This is kind of the very common master detail layout that's used in almost all of our system apps. You'll notice that in Portrait, it's not really visible here. We kind of need animations. We don't have the fancy technology to show this. But in Portrait, it's kind of a sliding screen. So that left pane collapses once you start interacting with the right detail pane. And then pressing the up button slides it in again. Or just actually sliding on the screen. And then in 10-inch tablets on landscape, we have all that space available, so we don't need that kind of that collapsing behavior, so it's always visible. Any thoughts, guys, on other things we should point out?
No, I really like the treatment on the 7-inch here, where it's not quite wide enough to have the same display as you have on the 10-inch to have all that information permanently on screen. So it's a nice solution with the sliding in and out to give you a lot of the benefits of having both on screen, like the quick interaction swapping between the current sessions, rather than having to do on the phone where you have to keep on going up and down, back up to see the other adjacent schedules.
Yeah, and one minor thing which I like is there's this sort of concept of links related to a particular session. So these are sort of dynamic links related to a session that fall below on the handset and let me see if I can zoom. And Nexus 7 version, but then if you go to the 10-inch version in landscape, you'll see they sort of fall alongside the content instead. So it's just
that gives a great way to give a margin, like a natural margin point as well, so that the details doesn't get too wide, I think.
Yep.
And I think one of the natural points here is really just about text length and white space, right? You really want to optimize for, to minimize large swaths of white space, where there's just nothing on screen. You don't want to throw information into along one of the edges of the screen or the corners. And then, like I said about the line lengths, you want to really optimize around a certain number of characters per line, because any larger, and it's going to be it's a little less easy to read in terms of like your eye having to jump to the next line. And then any smaller, it's kind of like a newspaper where if there's only like 2 or 3 words per line, it becomes really tedious reading a long, vertically long piece of text. So really, that's one of the optimization points, is to make sure that the text itself is very legible and that the white space is adequately filled. One last thing I wanted to point out is just a common thread across these. You'll notice that the green background maintains some of the branding for the track. So you'll notice that the icon, the action bar icon here, is colored green to indicate that you're looking at Android, and then the green is persistent across the different tablets. All right. So with that, let's move on to our last section, since we have 4 minutes left. Wow, we're on time, guys. That's awesome. Since we have 4 minutes left, let's jump into Android design news. So the first bit of news, and this is not really news. Sorry for lying to you people. So this is actually an article from Kirill Grachnikov, who's one of the engineers on one of Google's apps, one of Google's very popular apps. He wrote a series of articles on responsive mobile design. They're more like, I guess, developer focused, but they do focus a lot about the different switching points, the margin points, as Nick was alluding to, and how you make those decisions, and then basically how that affects your different layouts on tablets. I will caveat that this is a little over a year old, so some of the thinking is the older version, or the predecessor of what our current design thinking is, but it's a phenomenal intro to responsive mobile design. Moving on, Nick, I think this is yours.
Yeah, this is fantastic to see that this is one of the applications which we took a look at 2 weeks back, called Glimmer, which was an application for viewing photos from Flickr. And I just want to say good job to the developer Paul Bork, who's taken the designs and implemented them already. You can see the change here in the before and after of his first screen. So no longer is it just a plain just log in, but he actually shows up some content right from the beginning, and it looks really nice. I think he's done a wonderful job. So good job, Paul.
Yeah, totally. Well, good job, Nick, as well, for inspiring the initial designs. Next is The Verge. Nick, do you want to talk about that as well?
Yeah, sure. So The Verge, popular gadget, my go-to gadget news site, has just done a Holo redesign. So you can see here they've stayed pretty faithful to the Holo look and feel, while marrying it to their branding quite successfully, I feel. So generally a really nice job. A few issues with the navigation in the application, but they've done a good job. And I'm also really pleased to see them use the drawn navigation pattern pretty correctly. So that's very good to see.
Yeah. Next we have Action Bar Sherlock, and this is more focused towards developers. But Action Bar Sherlock is a library by the very famous Jake Wharton. It's a library that lets you use the action bar in all of its glory on devices that don't really have honeycomb or ice cream sandwich yet, for example, gingerbread devices. And the latest version, version 4.2, adds, I believe it's preliminary support for Search View. So if you've been designing around Search View because you must support gingerbread, this may be a good way to backport that view. And I think that's it for this week. I think we're 1 minute early. But again, thanks for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time, where we will actually be doing redesigns of video player apps that are reviewed this Friday, I believe, on the App Clinic. So thanks again, as always. I'm Roman Nurik.
Adam Koch.
Nick Butcher.
Signing off. See you guys later.
Thanks, guys. Bye.